Before we kick off our conference keynote, we would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. The Wyoming Arts Council respectfully acknowledges that the land we are on today across Wyoming is part of the traditional and contemporary homelands of the Shoshone and Arapaho nations and pays respects to them and the other Native nations, indigenous peoples with contemporary and historical ties to the Wyoming land, including the Arikara, Bannock, Blackfeet, Cheyenne, Crow, Gros Ventre, Kiowa, Lakota, Nez Perce, Omaha, Oto, and Ute. The Wyoming Arts Council is an institution of the state of Wyoming, and we understand that statehood came at a dire cost to Native nations and peoples whose land this state occupies. This acknowledgement is necessary as we recognize that we still have significant work to do as we look to build together a more just, inclusive, and equitable practice in the arts. Thank you. A few notes about the Arts Summit and today's keynote. We want people to do what they need to do in order to feel comfortable and engaged. Please take a break, stand and stretch, get a drink. Whatever you need to do to engage as fully as possible in the Arts Summit, as we recognize that everyone on this call are all very busy people. We will be recording all of the sessions and keynotes for the summit. So if you missed something or would like to revisit a session, you will have this as a resource. If you would like or need captions, you can use Zoom's live transcription feature. To turn on subtitles, click on the CC Live Transcript button on the bottom of your screen between the record and reactions icons. For today's keynote, please feel comfortable to have your camera on or off, and please use the chat feature for questions and comments. We will have a question and answer at the end of our keynote today, and please feel free to use the raise hand button, and please stay muted until then. All right, it is now my honor to introduce our keynote to kick off the 2021 Wyoming Arts Summit. We have been trying to get our next keynote out to the Arts Summit since 2014, and hosting this year virtually has made this a reality. Named a 2005 MacArthur Fellow, President Obama's first appointment to the National Council on the Arts, and member of President Biden's Arts Policy Committee, Aaron Dworkin served as the Dean of the University of Michigan's School of Music, Theater, and Dance, which is ranked among the top performing arts schools in the nation. He is currently a tenured full professor of arts leadership and entrepreneurship at the University of Michigan, as well as serving as a professor of entrepreneurial studies at the Stephen M. Ross School of Business. In addition, Aaron is a successful social entrepreneur, having founded the Sphinx Organization, the leading arts organization with the mission of transforming lives through the power of diversity in the arts. It is my pleasure to welcome Aaron Dworkin as our keynote speaker.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mike. And I am just so excited to be able to be here and excited for this time. And especially while I'm going to share some of my background and share some of the work that we've been doing, and especially really try to delve into some of these diversity, DE&I issues. I'm really looking forward to our time with Q&A, because I think that will really give us a chance to explore some of the ways in which what I've shared really relates to day-to-day work that you are doing, bringing the arts to so many people in Wyoming. So I'm really, really looking forward to that. So for some of this, and I'll try and come out a little bit when I'm doing my presentation. I do have a PowerPoint because there's a couple of graphs and some videos that I want to be able to share with you as well. So first things, I'm going to share my screen here. And as I do that, What I want to do, let me just make sure, here we go. And one of the things that I really love to start with is just a little bit of music. So, and of course, Hannah's one of many, many artists that we've been able to work with. And I'm going to give you a little more background on the work that we've done with Sphinx, and also especially how kind of entrepreneurship ties into so much of what we do with the arts. But I figure if we're going to, do all of this and talk about these issues, I think it's really important that you have a sense of, how did I get into this? Why do I even care about these issues? How did I come to this work? So I thought I would start at the very beginning. I was born on, of all days, 9/11, and in upstate New York, and I was immediately given up for adoption. I was adopted by a white Jewish couple who were from Chicago and moved to New York, who were neuroscientists, who were behavioral scientists. And they actually also already had a birth son, my older brother, who followed in their science footsteps. He's now a cellular biologist, biogeneticist at Columbia. So fast forward 31 years, I was reunited with my birth parents. My birth father, who's Black Jehovah's Witness, my birth mother, who's white Irish Catholic, who, after giving me up for adoption, ended up getting back together years later and had another child, my full sister, who they did raise, Maddie, who now practices law in New York. So basically, in the end, I'm a Black, white, Jewish, Irish, Catholic, Jehovah's Witness who grew up with a big afro playing the violin. So no big surprise, diversity has been kind of a theme in my life. And it's actually one of the things that I think is so important, and it goes to the arts and the integrity of the arts, that who we are should come through our art. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. I started playing the violin when I was 5. My mother, my adoptive mother, was an amateur violinist, and I was very energized and inspired by her playing, and so I really started delving into it and developed relatively quickly. I was originally in New York, the 92nd Street Y, and I began to play chamber music very early on. What happened throughout my trajectory, and I'll talk a little bit more when I get to college, but in especially classical music, right, there was always previously was kind of a sense, this is classical music, this is what it is. And of course, that was pretty much no Black composers or composers of color or things like that, of which, of course, part of my background reflected. And so when diversity began to incorporate itself into my music making, it changed the way the art impacted me. So I would say that no matter what, because there are, say, communities in Wyoming that might be very different than New York City or Detroit, where I've done a lot of programming, but wherever that is, and I've done it in a host of places across the country, there's always this aspect of diversity. What does that mean for our community? Who are all of the constituents in our community? And what do they mean to us? And how can we engage them with our art making, but also let our art making be influenced by these communities? And that's really where we get to the heart of some extraordinary work in the arts. And of course, I'll talk about that a little more soon. So when I was 10 years old, moved to Hershey, Pennsylvania, huge change from New York City to Hershey, Pennsylvania, at the time, one Black family, and me, you could see the big afro playing the violin. So I was actually very ostracized, unfortunately, and ended up, having a tough situation, getting kicked out or running away, things like that. And ultimately went to the Interlochen Arts Academy for my last 2 years of high school, an arts institution. And I credit Interlochen with saving my life. I think with the way as ostracized as I was, I think it was probably either dead or jail was probably going to be my outcomes, most likely. And Interlochen was the first time where I was surrounded by everyone who was in the arts. And so all of a sudden, skin color didn't, matter. It was way more important. Were you in creative writing or in dance or your arts discipline was way more of kind of an adjudicator of you and your social interactions than color. And so it was really a beautiful, amazing place. And I really grew in terms of my own artistic voice. From there, started out at Penn State for college. And had a number of experiences there. But unfortunately, just after 2 years, I had to drop out. And that led to 4 years off from college. During those 4 years, and I basically had I had a falling out with my parents. I wasn't living up to their expectations, so I wasn't in touch with them. My girlfriend at the time, who was white, her parents disowned her. They hadn't met me. And so that led to us not being able to stay in school. So that's why we ended up off for 4 years. But during those 4 years, I got a lot of, if you will, real world work experience. I was canvassing door to door for an environmental organization. I did for a consumer lobby. And so I gained a lot of experience during that time, even though it was very poverty stricken. And then something happened. I was living initially in Lansing and then Kalamazoo, Michigan, and ended up ultimately in Ann Arbor. And in Ann Arbor, homelessness was a very significant issue at the time. And I guess I've always had kind of this entrepreneurial streak, and I was, just like in terms of social justice, entrepreneurship. And I was very frustrated because I was like, why isn't something being done about this? Yes, we have emergency food and shelter, but the largest growing segment for homelessness at the time was single parents with children, mostly single women with children. And how could we build transitional housing, et cetera? And so I started a homeless organization. I didn't have a car. I was barely paying rent at an apartment. And so, but I felt this was so necessary. And we thought we had these answers with transitional housing, which was very new at the time. So long story short, trying that, I don't really know what I'm doing, so on and so forth, but I'm trying to make it work. Things are really tough. And as a last ditch effort for the organization, I send out a bunch of letters to celebrities because I think, oh, maybe they'll respond. One of the celebrities I sent a letter to was Robin Williams. At the time, Robin Williams had, along with Whoopi Goldberg, had done a series called Comic Relief. And it was comedy, but where they were supporting homelessness. And so I was like, they should want to help. And so I don't hear anything. I get a lot of rejections from over 100 letters that I send out. Can't keep the organization going, so I have to close it. Trying to figure out what to do, et cetera. Phone rings one day, and the woman on the other line says, "This is Marsha Williams. I'm calling about a letter to my husband." So I'm like, Marsha Williams. I'm like, oh my gosh, Robin Williams' wife at the time. And so end up having a long, almost 2 hours conversation with her. And the very first thing that I needed to share with her was that what I had written them about, I had failed. Right, basically. And it's interesting, there's a lot of business books out there now about failing forward and all of that. And, it's pretty easy. It's easier for me now when I teach my students, to say, hey, you've got to fail forward and do all of that. But when you're just struggling and you're in that kind of situation, to just be able to just be authentic and be what I wrote you about and asked you for help with, this homeless organization, it closed. They couldn't keep it going. But yet that conversation sparked, well, what are you doing and what's your situation and all of this? And I shared about how we had been at Penn State, so on and so forth, and couldn't stay in school. And all I wanted to do at that point was get back to my music. but I couldn't even apply to the University of Michigan because I couldn't get my transcripts from Penn State because all my loans were in default, my federal loans were in default, et cetera. So by the end of the conversation, she said, you know what? Send Robin and I copies of your student loans and we'll see what we can do. So of course I'm like, oh my gosh, right? So I have to track down all my student loan information. I send it all out. Meanwhile, I had given a recital at, even as a sophomore at Penn State, I sent a copy of my recital. I had written poetry. I sent, copies of my poetry, all of this. So anyway, sent it all off. Of course, real life continued, got evicted, ended up getting a job in the mailroom of a local company, moved into a new place, mail forwarding and all of that. About a month and a half later, that October, a letter envelope comes in the mail from Joel Faden Financial Companies. So probably more bill collectors. Open it up, just a very short cover page said, enclosed, please find copies of checks made out in your behalf from Robin Williams' account. And they had paid off all of my student loans to Penn State, and they had caught all of my federal loans up out of default. Total stranger. I was a college dropout, right? They didn't know me. I obviously didn't know them. And so they took that chance and it changed my life because it enabled me to be able to go back to school and go back to college, which I did. And I went to Michigan, now 4 years older than my peers. But knowing the real world, man, I was pulling every ounce of value out of college education, right? It wasn't like before where I was kind of like, should I go to class? I was like, oh my gosh, right? And I learned the value of college debt or the pain, the burden of college debt. And so it was while I was there, I went into a lesson one day and my teacher said, do you want to play music by Black composers? And I was actually a little bit put off, because I didn't know there were any Black composers. I'm like, I'm a real violinist, so what are you kind of placating me or so, he kind of starts smiling, pulls volumes of works off of his shelves. William Grant Still, Roque Cordero, Joseph Boulon St. George, an Afro-French contemporary of Mozart, right? And so I learned there are all of these composers that I never knew existed, phenomenal music. And so I ended up being able to focus on that for my undergraduate and graduate degrees. And at the same time, I'd go to orchestra concerts. I wouldn't see anyone on stage who looks like me or in the audience. And so that kind of led to this idea, what if there was a competition literally for students like me? We could come together, learn and play this music by composers of color, gain scholarships and resources because I didn't have some missed out opportunities to go to Aspen and other great summer festivals because I didn't get enough scholarship support and couldn't afford it. And if we did that, then that would just solve all the problems and all of classical music would become diverse. So, as I was thinking about these things, right, and in retrospect, I think about these institutions that played such a role. Interlochen, Penn State, Michigan, where these institutions valued my diversity, valued my recruitment. So how we carry about this DEI work matters. And I'm going to share some numbers with you, but I just want you to understand that it affects people's lives very, very significantly. And so as I was thinking about this and, well, what if this, how do we do this? Part of that science, I think, upbringing from my parents and brother was that, you can't solve a problem if you haven't quantified it, right? What is the problem? What is the question you're trying to answer? So I'll run through some of these slides just a little quickly because I don't want to hamper on numbers for our whole time together, but I do want to give you a sense of just a snapshot. And you can think about this and think about, well, in my community, where is the underrepresentation? It may or may not relate to African-American or Latinx people, which is an example I'm going to give. It may relate to other underserved communities. So as I went about my work, I was looking, and this is this snapshot that gives us a sense of diversity in the classical music field and a great barometer are orchestras. No big surprise when we look at orchestras, just under 2% Black, about 2.5% Latinx, 7% Asian, and the balance are white. So we can obviously see some key underserved communities. When we look at music directors, similar numbers, about 2% Black, 2% Latinx. When we look at executive directors, right, the key administrative leader for orchestras, less than half of 1% are Black, less than 1% are Latino. And if we look at artistic administrators, right, so other than the maestro, the key leadership artistic role in an orchestra across all of America's orchestras, the entire country, 0% statistically are Black or Latinx. Even if we look at education and community relations directors, the key position with an orchestra charged with engaging the community, faith-based communities, it's still only 3% Black and a little over 2% Latinx. If we begin to look at some other areas, top 10 composers, no big surprise, 0% are Black or Latinx. But it's important to break out, right, North American composers, because we actually perform very few North American composers. Even if we only look at that subset, US and Canadian composers, it's still 0%. So Sphinx has been doing its work right now for almost 25 years. If we had as our goal to have just 1% of all of the works performed by all American orchestras be by any composer of color, we have yet to reach that milestone as a nation. My hope, I'm optimistic that this past year has created more change than any other in my lifetime. It is possible once we get the data and the statistics from this year that we finally may have broken that barrier. But again, these are numbers, right? But behind each number is a story like mine and a story like so many young people in each and every one of your communities. I love the famed author Chimamanda Adichie, and she talks about the danger of a single story. She says the danger of a single story is not that it is untrue, but that it is incomplete. The stories we weave in the arts are incomplete. And I ardently believe that working on that, making them more complete, doesn't just benefit our art form, it benefits the communities that we serve. So now that I've kind of given you some of this background and backdrop, instead of kind of talking at you about what Sphinx actually does, I'm going to show this short video, which will give you a sense of the work of Sphinx.
The perception that the talent isn't out there within communities of color is so deeply false in classical music.
Wow, drop the mic. There are millions of kids like this in this country who do not have the resources to become everything that they could be. But fortunately, these programs are doing the job that the bigger society fails to do.
Sphinx's mission is transforming lives through the power of diversity in the arts. And we address the issue of lack of diversity and inclusion through a sense of a pipeline. We have Overture program replace violins in the hands of young people for the first time.
I definitely believe that the Sphinx Overture program has made a difference in this community.
The Sphinx competition is our flagship program. It's a wholesome approach to musician development that goes beyond the competitive mechanism. Sphinx Connect is the epicenter for artists and leaders in diversity, devoted to the issues of inclusion, leadership, and career advancement. We have Sphinx Symphony, which is a professional, all African American and Latino orchestra. And then we have the Sphinx Virtuosi, which is an ensemble of soloists that performs across the country, everywhere from Carnegie Hall to Harris Theater in Chicago, and really communities beyond.
I think the Sphinx Organization is so incredibly important. It tries to achieve in our society an equilibrium of people who are incredibly talented and motivated to be part of every aspect of our society.
Sphinx has done tremendous work over its first 20 years. And I think that over the next 20 years, Sphinx will truly transform the lives of millions of more people.
So again, that's just to be able to kind of share a quick, snapshot of the work of Sphinx. And in addition to what you saw there, we now have an administrative program that's helping to develop the next generation of administrative leaders of color, as well as Sphinx Tank, which is developing entrepreneurs of color in the field as well, because we really need new organizations entering into the field. And so similarly, the way I mentioned about other institutions, and I think about young people, the very first documentary that was done on Sphinx, and a young person said, I've never known a world without Sphinx, right? Which is so, even to this day, it affects me because I think about my own childhood in the sense of isolation. And one of the most important things, separate from all the numbers and the data, right? Because, and funders need those and all of that, we all have to be good administrative leaders. But one of the most important things that we've been able to create with Sphinx is what all of the Sphinx alums call La Familia. Sorry, that's it just is, always definitely affects me. So I wanted to kind of cover just really quickly a few areas about developing a creative career, right? Because as we think about these aspects of whether we're training people to become artists, whether we're impacting arts organizations, all of the various work that we do, this idea of developing creative careers, I think, centers around some core kind of fundamentals that I just wanted to share at least a few thoughts. One is innovation, which is absolutely not easy. And I love Brene Brown's, famed, organizational leader, says there is no innovation and creativity without failure, period. I have failed more times than I could possibly remember. But that's what's so important, is enabling organizations who we might fund and or people who we interact with, especially entrepreneurs, to have that space to fail. Because if we don't, there will be no innovation, and we thrive on innovation. Writing, very, very simple. We need writing skills. You have to be able to capture through the written word the work that we do in the arts, which is often different than writing and is often performative. But it's very, very key. Entrepreneurship and all of the entrepreneurial skill sets are really very, very key to all of this. At Michigan, when I was dean, we developed what we refer to as Excel, which captures all of this work. So we do coursework, then we have workshops, but then we have support, and then ultimately empowerment. We're currently providing direct grants to students more than any other arts school in the country. So it's important to not only provide the curriculum and provide access to professionals in the field, but then we have to directly support our students with funding so they can actually realize this work. And one of those things about bringing in mentors, access to professionals, this was one of my latest books, The Entrepreneurial Artist, where I wanted to be able to provide these real world case studies for students. So I interviewed, the leading artists, entrepreneurs across these different disciplines, and then identified what are the key takeaways from entrepreneurship that we can learn from in their stories. And a chapter is dedicated to each of them. So for musical theater, Lin-Manuel Miranda; for theater, Jeff Daniels; jazz, Wynton Marsalis; for dance, Bill T. Jones; for music, and especially, all of the recording and electronic music, holiday music, Chip Davis; Marin Alsop conducting, list goes on and on. So it's, again, important to identify what are these resources that we can provide for our students. As you're probably beginning to see, I love quotes. And this one from Albert Einstein: strive not to be a success, but rather to be of value. And I think that's so important when we're talking, again, with young people about, don't just, I want to be on stage, I want to wow people, but how can I be of value? How can my art be of value to my community? Because then it will be valued by your audience, by your community. And every year, Sphinx holds our Medals of Excellence. It's the highest honor Sphinx bestows, and those are celebrated at the Supreme Court each year, Justice Sotomayor and others. And at it, I always quote this quote from Aristotle, which is that excellence is an art won by training and habituation. We do not act rightly because we have virtue or excellence, but we rather have those because we have acted rightly. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. And that's something, again, when we think about these creative skill sets, how we approach excellence, not just that we're preparing for a jury or an audition, but rather how are we bringing excellence as a habit to the artistic work that we do. And then finally, I just want to touch on this portfolio career life, because I think it's so important, especially for all of us in the arts, which is that we often don't do one thing. And so managing it, and all too often, a lot of people fall into a portfolio life. And I think just like our financial portfolios, we should plan, how are we going to architect a life that satisfies all of the needs that we want to fulfill for ourselves, for community, for compensation, for all of these different things. And so I thought I'd just share a quick snapshot of my portfolio life, which is very intentional and is also always evolving. So of course, my main piece, right, is at Michigan at the School of Music, Theater, and Dance, where I'm a professor doing my main teaching, all of that. I also do some teaching and things at Michigan Ross, which is our business school. But then I also still advise for Sphinx, even though I stepped down from my formal role 6 years ago when I served as dean at Michigan. I'm also an author, so I have a science fiction book, some other books, and I do spoken word art. So American Rhapsody is a work that I do that involves the words and writings actually of George Washington and a commentary on that, combined with Samuel Coleridge Taylor, a Black British composer. So it's a kind of a very interesting work. I do presenting and speaking, of course, like this, and I serve on boards. I'm on the National Council for the Arts. And we have the Dworkin Foundation where we do some stuff. I actually do some digital asset investing as well. I serve on the Michigan or the board of our Michigan Theater in Ann Arbor, Chamber Music America, our community foundation. I also do some digital art, and my book, as I mentioned, and my movie, which won an Emmy this past year, I was very excited about, which is about the pandemic. And I have weekly shows, Arts Engines, as well as Artful Science, that I definitely encourage you to check out, by the way, free to watch and to check out. So this is my portfolio life. And I think a very important thing to note is that I don't feel overwhelmed by it, because it is intentionally architected in terms of the time, how I apply it to all of these different components, and the valuation of each of them. So developing that portfolio life is really, really key. And as we think about how we do the arts, I wanted to share kind of two different that are actually formal human resource policies that we developed at Sphinx, but ways in which how we gather and bring people together. So one is that Sphinx operates as a ROE, which is results only work environment. So long before COVID, Sphinx was a hybrid workplace. So when COVID happened and all that shut down, it was actually very, very smooth for Sphinx, because people were already used to how do we work independently. There were some people in the office every day, other people were in the office every 2 weeks. The only thing that matters are the results that are measured very specifically. And then Susan Scott, who developed Fierce Conversations and Fierce Leadership, which is how we communicate authentically, honestly. So we have space for not harsh, but direct criticism, which is what improves the work that we do. And so again, just really important ways to be able to come together with other people to accomplish this work that usually in the arts, we have to accomplish more with less than many other fields. And I'm sure all of you have experienced that. So ultimately, my hope is that my story will encourage each and every one of you in your role to act, to throw the dice, as so to speak. Definitely feel free to connect with me. My email is Maverick Violin. My nickname's Maverick. And or I'm on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram. And imagine a future if you were the one who could determine if these things could happen, because you absolutely are. You are on the front lines of this work. And what if you choose to experience this speech a little differently in terms of how you evolve and how you value diversity, and especially how diversity is defined in your community? And ultimately, what if you just take what all I can offer, which are just words, but actually make them tangible through the work that you do? I wanted to close with these two pictures of Martin Luther King and his wife, Coretta Scott King. Music was incredibly important in their lives. And, in the movement. And they grew up with a piano in the home. And years ago, Patrice Jackson, the cellist you see there on the bottom, we were at a Black Philanthropy conference in Atlanta, and Coretta Scott King was there, and Patrice performed for her. And afterwards, Coretta came up to me and we were able to speak. And it was impactful because she shared this importance directly about the role that music played in their lives and in the movement. And it makes me think of the words of her husband, who said, "Change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, but comes through continuous struggle. History will have to record that the greatest tragedy of this period was not the strident clamor of the bad people, but the appalling silence of the good people. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter." And I submit to all of you, let me just stop my screen share here. And I submit to all of you that this work that each and every one of you do, that we all do in the arts, matters. And with that, Mike, I'd love to be able to address some questions. And thank you all again so much for inviting me virtually into your space. And hopefully I'll have the opportunity next time I'm in Wyoming to actually potentially meet some of you in person.
Wonderful. Aaron, thank you so much for your inspirational talk with us today and sharing all the wonderful things you've been doing and your organizations have been doing. We would love to stand for any questions. We can do questions a handful of ways. If you have a question and would like to drop it in the chat box, please feel free to do that. There's also under the reactions, you can actually raise your hand and unmute yourself, and we can take questions that way as well. And Aaron, while people are starting to kick this off, I would love to kick a first question to you.
Sure.
To maybe just help us get started. Inside of all these, all these wonderful projects you've been working on and organizations you've started, you still have you are still a violinist. You're still a practicing musician. And I wonder how I wonder if you could talk a bit about how you have over the years really been able to focus on your practice as a musician, as well as all of the other wonderful projects you're working on.
Yeah, well, it's such a good question, that balance. And for me now, and actually for a few years, that has shifted to the spoken word. And in some ways, the spoken word has become that primary instrument for me and evolved from the violin. But I do regularly perform, and was actually, I think I had 8 orchestral performances that were canceled due to COVID, but they're starting up again this year. So again, what I do is I look at that scheduling. And so I make sure that it won't conflict. Obviously, there's a fair amount that I do during the summer, since the time of teaching is different that I have during the summer. And I also don't do too much. So they often say for entrepreneurs, some of the most important decisions they make are the things they decide not to do. So there are absolutely performance opportunities, speaking opportunities, et cetera, that I have to turn down. And it all you have to make sure that it goes into that plan. And I use technology to a great extent. So anytime I'm planning something, obviously I'm looking in my Google Calendar and all that, but I also have my tasks. So I look at my tasks I'll give you an example of, some of the methods I use. Every Sunday evening, I look at my next week and I make sure there isn't a day where there are tasks or calendar items where things are going to be too overwhelming. And if they are, then I modify them. And then I do that every evening right before the next day. And in that way, just those little things enable you to never enter into a day with kind of, oh my gosh, I don't know what's happening, all these things, et cetera, because of that planning.
Wonderful, thank you. Is anyone open for asking some questions? Andrew, please feel free to jump on. Thank you.
Hi, Aaron. Thank you for the really inspiring presentation. I am coming to you from Casper, Wyoming, which is in the middle of the state. And I was just wondering if you could muse on Wyoming a little bit and where you see, if you have any thoughts about where you see us going, our opportunities to work in more inclusive ways with more diverse communities. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And also I've had some, albeit brief, but wonderful times in Wyoming. And driving through, I drive a lot. So I have driven through and stayed in Wyoming a number of times, especially en route to Washington and a few other states as well. And so here's a prime example, right, where there may be, right, not maybe, there obviously are a number of communities in Wyoming where we'd be like, okay, we simply do not have the demographics where it would necessarily make sense to be focusing on having 10% of our audience be African American, right? Say something like that. So for each community, I would say to look at, and there's two sides to this. So one is to say, who are we engaging in our community? And to say, who comprises it and who comprises our audience that we're reaching with our art making? And identifying through that, are there people in our community, parts of our community that we are not reaching? And then asking why. So in other words, diversity, it never should it be this kind of, X% of this, this kind of numbers game, but rather a thoughtful thing of what's our role, who's our community, and are we serving them? Who are we missing? And how can we engage them? Right. So that's definitely one kind of key part of it. And I wouldn't want to dictate what that should be for your specific community. And within Wyoming, it will be different in Casper versus, say, some other, communities that might be more rural or those types of things. So you want to kind of look and see where that representation is. The second part of this is, what are we creating with our art? And so are there communities, are there stories of African Americans that are, say, maybe, let's just say hypothetically, our current audience that's, 85, 90% white would be interested in? Should we, through our art, bring these stories? One of the very early things I did within the first year of founding Sphinx was bringing our artists of color, to Northern Michigan, communities that were 99% white. And because we were bringing their stories, and the amazing things happen. And to me, this is where this huge part of what we do and with diversity is so important. Unfortunately, for any host of reasons, some of which have just kind of surprised me, our country seems to be more divided or divisive than in my entire lifetime. But when I'm in an art space, people could have completely polar opposite political beliefs in the same artistic experience, and those differences are stripped away temporarily, but they're stripped away. What I find is then when we come back together or potentially at each other after that experience, we have a greater sense of tolerance, a greater sense of understanding, a greater sense of shared humanity because of that artistic experience. So sharing the voices of those who may not be represented in your community is equally important, because it goes to this role, this service that I believe the arts have in our nation, more importantly than ever has happened in our past. Two quick stories of that. One, we were in Memphis with the Sphinx Virtuosi touring orchestra, and a young white girl and her family came up after the concert, and she was in tears, and she wanted to meet one of the young musicians that she just felt had like changed her life with his music on stage. So I brought them out back, and and we actually brought him off. They were already getting back on the tour bus, and brought him off of the bus. And seeing that moment of interaction, of shared humanity, that's who we are, right? That's what our humanity is all about, and I believe what our nation is all about, these shared stories that can be so different in so many ways. And the second, in some ways, is more pragmatic, and to outline that difference, which is, I don't want to call out specific justices, but you can probably guess, but a former justice at the Supreme Court, who unfortunately passed away, who's very, very conservative, and a justice who is very, very liberal. You pretty much can't get polar opposites. I have seen them in the same space, right, in one of our artistic experiences, and you see their passion and their love for the art. And that was reflected, even despite a massive political disagreement, a respect and a tolerance and a human like for each other, even though they believed different things about policy and certain judicial things. And so the power of the arts is critically important. And that's why I think this diversity, both thinking about your audience, but then also thinking about the art that you're making and bringing to them. Sorry to run on a little bit there. I'll try to be briefer, but that was such a great question. Thanks so much, Andrew.
Aaron, great thing. Thank you so much. It looks like Denise Patton, you have a question. Please feel free to take yourself off of mute.
Thanks for your very inspiring message. The Arts Council was right on as far as bringing you in, I think. I'm overwhelmed just by looking at the various things, your book, your movie, the various organizations that you started and brought about and are fostering. And it reminds me of what I believe a true artist is in really exploring and, as you said, failing forward, or true exploration all the time. But I think about some of those artists, and I think they didn't do it on their own. Even though, and so I'd like to hear about a little of the support network. I know that early on you had extraordinary support just through not just through risk taking, but risk taking. You took the risks you had to. And so can you describe or ruminate a little bit on your support network for the wonderful work that you do?
Yeah, no, and thank you so much, Denise, for it was a great question. So I'll talk about individually and organizationally. So individually, you are so right, and make no mistake about it, absolutely nothing that I've been able to accomplish in life did I do by myself. Not a chance, right? Not a chance. So I've always had that support system, and obviously first and foremost my family, my extraordinary wife, who you saw on the video, and we were just friends. We actually worked together for 6 years before we began a relationship. And when I stepped down, she was the executive director and kind of managing everything except the board and finances. And then the board ended up appointing her to be president after I had stepped down. So we had an opportunity until 6 years ago to work directly together for so many years. But still, everything that we do is so intertwined. And that portfolio life would not be possible or exist without our amazing partnership and friendship. And also, so early on, and I always talk about this with entrepreneurs, that was one of the first things in building Sphinx. She was the first employee. She was, we were in the same studio class at Michigan, and I was like, and identifying who do you know who knows more or is better at the things that are needed for the project that you're trying to start or the difference you're trying to make. And she knew more about music, like knowledge about composers and all that, way more than me and way more than anyone else I knew. And she was a better violinist. She was originally trained at the Moscow and then Baku Conservatory in Azerbaijan. And so I just had the utmost respect for her knowledge and wisdom that she was able to bring to bear. And the same thing, identifying people who might be great writers and so on and so forth. So assembling a team around you, all of whom are better than you at the work that is that particular aspect of what needs to get done, I think is critically important. And then there's organizationally. From the get-go, from the very first time when I went into my lesson and I said to my teacher, I've got this idea, and he was like, yeah, you didn't practice, but was willing to hear the idea. We took it to the dean of the school. And so that was able to then result in the University of Michigan's School of Music at the time. We weren't all music, theater, and dance yet. Being the first partner of Sphinx. And without those organizational partners, we wouldn't have been able to do that work right now. And now Sphinx has over 100 national and international partners, all music schools, orchestras, etc. So all of that work that you saw in the video that's able to happen wouldn't even happen. So both individually, we need teams, but also organizationally. No single organization can do this work. We need teams, and we need to be able to come together and collaborate. So yeah, thanks so much, Denise. Great question.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Denise. It looks like Ann Mason, I saw you next for a question. Ann, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. And Aaron, thank you so much for your time and your message, your words, all of this that you have to share with us today. I'm coming to you from Laramie, Wyoming, where I run a theater company, and definitely think of myself as, see myself and identify as a theater artist as well as an arts entrepreneur. And with the university being here in Wyoming, or in Laramie, it's also the only one in Wyoming, but like 4 years, but work with a lot of students and strive to help them own this identity as an arts entrepreneur. But I'm wondering, actually, to take a step beyond that, what advice you might have for artists that wish to do more interdisciplinary collaboration with entrepreneurs in STEM, science, technology, or any sort of area that is specific, that is not necessarily rooted in the arts, but can be enriched by an artist's participation?
Yes, great question, Anne. Absolutely. I believe in it very wholeheartedly. I think that absolutely should be the case. So several things. So one, it just so happens that I have a weekly show called Artful Science. And each week we bring on a scientist, a leading scientist, researcher, talking about partnerships. Our main partner is NASA for that show. And so, I've talked with those who are, landing, sending rocket ships up, doing remote sensing from satellites back to Earth, all kinds of things. However, we talk about how it relates to artists. And how many of them engage and collaborate with artists. So A, just something along those lines. And B, I encourage them to actually reach out. So if there is local university, reach out to the physics department or engineering or whoever you might want to. There are many, many colleges and universities now that are developing these cross-disciplinary things. And there is actually a national movement called, oh my gosh, A2RU. So literally numeral 2RU, which is the Arts at Research Universities. And this was launched actually from Michigan, where we have one of these components, which is called Arts Engine, which is different than Arts Engines, which is my show, but my other show, but Arts Engine. So Arts Engine is at Michigan. We have engineering, the School of Art and Design, the School of Music, Theater, and Dance, and the School of Architecture and Urban Planning, all on North Campus. And so those 4 schools came together and developed and fund this Arts Engine, which just creates and is solely focused on providing funding and grants and shared learning opportunities for students and curriculum that is exactly what you're talking about. So being able to kind of do that, and of course the movement from STEM to STEAM, there is a STEM to STEAM caucus in our national, in Congress, in DC. So there's a host of different places where people can go to learn more, but ultimately I believe it starts directly with just reaching out and saying, hey, I'd like to collaborate with you, or you know what, are you interested in having an artist in your lab? That kind of thing. But again, great question, Anne. And for all of these, but if there's any additional information I can provide, always feel free to follow up with me.
Thank you.
Great, thanks.
And next, I see Dr. Bruce Richardson has his hand up. Bruce, if you'd like to unmute and ask a question.
Oh, thank you so much, Aaron, for everything you said. This is just fantastic. And I have to say, I've got chills up my back looking at all the talented and energetic people that are in the boxes here. This
cool.
A portrait of people all over Wyoming, spread very far apart. But a lot of us know each other, and we gather and do things. And so this is a meaningful moment, just to be together in all our boxes. And I also have to say, my wife's a violinist, and she's upstairs right now practicing Beethoven's Fifth for a concert next week. So that's happening. But my question I had was, you have a wonderful national presence, and you see your mission in terms of both the local and the national. Do you have things that you're hoping for from the National Endowment for the Arts with Jackson as the new director, or do you? I'm sure you would have some advice, and we'd like to hear what those would be.
Yeah, so I'm lucky enough to have actually known Maria for many years. And I actually serve on the National Council for the Arts, and have now served through 3 administrations. I was Obama's first appointment, and then served through Trump, and now still serving. So we'll see how long. I guess at some point I will be transitioned, shall we say. So yes, I think it's a very unique time. I think she's, of course, a phenomenal choice. I think she's going to be phenomenal at it. I think that a number of things. One, at the council, we've been really doing a lot of work with arts and healing, which is so critically important. And especially we've been partnered with DOD and Walter Reed for treating wounded warriors, returning home, and the power of the arts. And of course, DOD is all about metrics and data, but that really we were able to show. And they were able to see that, especially for TBI, traumatic brain injury, that this impact of the arts is huge and significant. And so those programs have been able to multiply out across a number of DOD sites around the country. So I think that, she'll be looking at that work and seeing how the arts plays a role in healing, for sure. And I don't want to speak for her, but I can only imagine these are the types of things. And I think a little of what I would hope is this aspect about divisiveness and the role that the arts can play. We're always going to have people with different political viewpoints and especially policy differences and all of that. But our country has been filled with different people since day one, and it's how do we engage with each other? How do we interact? And I think the arts is, if not one of the most critically important factors that enables us to do that in a way that moves us all forward. And so I think that the NEA has a role and a place to do that and to serve that role. And of course, I would be not a good arts administrator or arts entrepreneur, but I'd say funding. That's what we all want from our state arts councils and from the national council, because it matters, obviously. And one of the first, really great significant grants I got with Sphinx was when we got our Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs. And not only that, but I learned so much because it was an open review process, and I could see what were we doing right, what weren't we doing right. So it was not only the grant funding, but the learning that I was able to get early on from my state arts council was just so important. And sorry, one last thing I would say is the camaraderie. So both the camaraderie, as you just mentioned, right? All of your colleagues from Wyoming, coming together and being able to do that, and then all of our states doing that, and then having a national sense of that camaraderie and coming together. And whether it's through NASA, National Association of State Arts Agencies, and also the NEA directly, as well as Americans for the Arts, I think that national sense is important as well.
Yeah, shout out to my friend John Bracey. He's, a kind of god of state arts agency people. What he did in Michigan for you.
Such a dear friend, and is so impactful in my life.
Mine too.
Great, thank you, Bruce. I do not see any other hands up right now, Aaron. So this might be. I saw one come in in the chat. So maybe we'll do this one and then we'll close, Aaron. If that sounds good with you.
Sounds great.
So the question from Denise: have you ever gone into a residency or retreat to coalesce or a particular body of work?
So it's interesting. I have not done a formal retreat, an artist retreat, artist colonies, where we have dedicated spaces, especially a lot of composers, visual artists, have gone, and actually Sphinx has funded artists to go and do that. I have not done it specifically, although I think that they are phenomenally and critically important, and also just often beautiful spaces, places to be in. For me, because when I have created, and especially works where I've done these kind of multi-component works, like American Rhapsody, it's music and writing and those types of things, or my book projects, I've often created those spaces myself, whether at home, in home, and certainly got, I think, very, very good at that in the last year and a half during COVID. We used places in our house that we never used before in unique ways and reoriented them to kind of feel like we kept going to different spaces and places. And so I've just always been able to create those spaces for myself, for my own art making. But I definitely, think and would love to be able to engage in one of those spaces at some point, and might for a future work.
Thank you.
Well, Aaron, let me kind of toss the closing question to you as we wrap up, and I think I'd love for you to kind of wrap in any closing comments you may have. But I would love to know what your hope is for the arts in America, looking through, as you mentioned, through 3 different administrations coming on the National Council, as we're moving into another new administration. What is your hope for the arts across America in the coming years?
Wow. So, well, I think multiple things come to mind. One, and this is probably because it's always in my mind, a well-funded field where we have the resources to do the work that needs to be done, and where the arts are viewed like so many other industries in our nation. When it comes to financially, the economic impact we have, rivals any of these other very significant industries. When we think about the arts exports that we send all over the world, both the economic impact as well as the influential impact that has. These are all huge. And so I think that we should, for example, have an arts czar. I think there should be a secretary level role for the arts in our country, not just the chairman of the NEA. So I think those things, well-funded and well-organized, and a role that has some level of access to the highest levels in our government directly as a secretarial level, which could then collaborate with other agencies. And we're able to do that to a certain extent, but having a secretary level position for the arts would obviously give a lot more weight and heft and ability for the arts to position ourselves. And in terms of the arts themselves, my hope is that in a relatively short period of time, yes, maybe even 3 to 5 years, that they are able to bring us closer together. That there's no, and I think anyone who says the arts will get rid of, divisiveness or those types of things is silly. That there will always be some level, but where we will find that we value and treasure what we share more than what we differ, and that the arts will have played a major role in helping us to get there.
Wonderful. Aaron, as always, great to have you as part of our conversation today and part of the Arts Council Arts Summit. Is there any other closing remarks you'd like to make before I just kind of plug our events for tomorrow?
Yeah, well, just to say thank you, Mike, for all of your leadership. Thank you for inviting me to come and spend this time, and hopefully I'll be able to see you in person, physically sometime soon. And thank you to everyone who's been able to be part of this session and the wonderful questions. It's been wonderful, and I very much look forward to keeping in touch with all of you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Sharon. And we look forward to times where we can meet in person again ourselves, and look forward to you being part of those gatherings in the future. Just a plug for tomorrow. As I mentioned, we're doing events in the afternoon throughout the week. So next week we will have, not next week, my apologies, tomorrow, Tuesday, in the afternoon, we have 3 wonderful sessions. The first, Art Saves Lives, the healing power of the creative voice, which I think will be wonderful. This will be followed by a session on advocacy called Grassroots Advocacy from a Single Seed, which is hosted by our partners over at the Wyoming Arts Alliance, and will feature a handful of different advocacy leaders from across the West. And then our final event for tomorrow is an image exchange where Wyoming visual artists who have signed up will be able to share their portfolio